I do remember that the police were called out at one point because somebody had reported two men fighting and bleeding along a pathway near the supermarket in Aberystwyth. And so that was a lesson in how people kind of interpret what you're doing when you're filming, when there isn't a film crew around.
Start from the word go. When did you decide this is what you wanted to do?
So, I mean, I'm originally from Wales. I grew up in the countryside in the middle of nowhere, and I was really obsessed as a young person with both painting and drawing and acting, and I thought I wanted to act. And I ended up going and doing a performing arts course, and it was while I was on the performing arts course that I got my first opportunity to officially direct something. And I directed an absurdist play by Ionesco called The Chairs. And I think through that experience, as well as seeing myself acting on camera, I decided that I wanted to be on the other side of the performance. And I was always really obsessed with film, and we were kind of mainly working on that course with theatre, within theatre, but I really liked taking the scenes that we were doing and placing them in real locations and filming. And it was kind of through that experience, I suppose, that I started to realize that I was interested in being a filmmaker. And at the time, I didn't really distinguish between, for example, directing and editing. So I learned how to edit. I taught myself how to edit. I think the first editing course that I went on was a linear VHS editing course, and then taught myself how to, work on non-linear programs like Premiere, and started to make my own short films living in Wales with my mates, and from there ended up moving to London and studied film.
Were you always the kind of person that just did things? You seem like a real doer. You're like, okay, so I taught myself to do this. I mean, that's really impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like there wasn't loads to do in Wales. So I've always been very project minded, in terms of both within the drawing that I was doing. I used to create my own comics and things like that. And so learning to edit was really fun for me. It was something that, allowed me to, I guess, explore story and express myself and play with atmosphere in weird ways. I was really interested in sound design. And so, yeah, I definitely think I've always been the kind of person that goes, okay, let's just see how we can model this together.
Well, it's learning on the job, as they say, but clearly that has worked for you. Tell me more about when you started making films with your friends. What happened there?
Well, I wrote the first short film that I ever wrote and shot, which was shot on a DV camera. I did everything myself, except for my mum came with the car at one point and lit some outdoor nighttime scenes for me with her car headlights. A couple of my friends, because I was on a performing arts course, a couple of friends from the course played the main characters. And I do remember that the police were called out at one point because somebody had reported two men fighting and bleeding along a pathway near the supermarket in Aberystwyth. And so that was a lesson in how people kind of interpret what you're doing when you're filming, when there isn't a film crew around. But yeah, I mean, I suppose I was already working in a kind of genre space at that point, even though I didn't really know what I was doing. I was just writing stories and putting them together however I could. But that was, I guess, a film noir, film. And then there was other stuff I was doing, just sketches and things with my friends.
Can you talk to me in as much detail as you'd like about the kind of people, let's take Censor as, your major film as an example, the kind of people you collaborated with, how you found them, and what kind of working relationships you had?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's quite a few people that I've worked with over numerous short films that I work with on Censor. So for example, first off, my director of photography, who's my longest collaborator, we met in university. We both went to the London College of Printing, Annika Summerson, she's called. She arrived in the second year, and I needed a DOP for a project, and took a punt on the new girl, and we've been working together ever since that point. So I always remind young filmmakers that, you know, particularly when I do talks at film schools or universities, that your collaborators might be sitting next to you. You know, don't think that they're people that you're going to meet, you know, on a job in a few years' time. They might be people you're already working with. And Annika's an incredibly talented DOP, and I was lucky to kind of find her at that point. And I guess I've always tried to think about how the work that somebody's, you know, if I'm collaborating on a project with somebody, and it, you know, early music videos, early short films, those people aren't getting paid, how is that project going to benefit that person as well? You know, if you're growing together side by side, then I think that person's more likely to come back and work with you again. If you treat people well, if you make sure that they get copies of whatever they need in order to develop their own portfolio, you know, all of those things are reasons why those relationships can kind of grow and become mutually beneficial. And I think that's really important. It's not all about you figuring out what you can get from other people. It's about how you develop and grow together. And so within that, you know, there's been other team members, like my makeup artist Ruth Pease, who I worked with on Censor, and I first worked with her on a music video. I found her through I was basically looking for somebody who could do kind of the creepy doll makeup and sort of weird, horrible horror makeup for this music video. And somebody recommended that I looked at the London College of Fashion's graduate website. So I looked on there and I found some of Ruth's work, and it was incredible. So I got in touch and said, you know, I'm a filmmaker, my films have screened at these festivals, would you be interested in working together? That was how we met. And again, we've been working together ever since. So, you know, there's different ways of finding people. I met my sound designer at a film festival in Paris, even though he's based in London. He was working with another director that I knew, and I thought his work was amazing. And when I had a short film, I approached him about that. And again, that's Tim Harrison, who ended up doing the sound design on Censor. And then my co-writer, Anthony Fletcher, who, when I was looking for a writer to work with, I reached out to different filmmaker friends and asked them for writer recommendations, and got in touch with people they'd recommended and read the scripts and met with those people. And that was how I found Anthony. And I remember the first meeting me and Anthony ever had, and I liked the fact that he politely disagreed with me when he didn't agree with me. Like, I want to work with people who can be honest with me. I don't want to work with people who are just going to say, you know, that's a great idea when it's not a great idea. And obviously there needs to be room for healthy debate. And as the director and the leader of the project, you then have to take that information from your collaborator and essentially gauge whether or not you agree with it, or whether you really actually feel steadfast in your idea. And so I think that's something, is like, I'm not always looking for somebody to collaborate with who, you know, aligns exactly with everything I think. I think it's really healthy to have different points of view and different approaches, and, you know, people who maybe don't necessarily work in the type of film or genre that you're working in, because they're going to bring something else to that, something fresh. So yeah, I suppose that's a few of the long-term collaborators. I could go on, but I'm sure there's other questions.
That's brilliant. I think it just shows, you know, keeping an open mind seems to be a big part of what you're saying, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons it's so successful. You've got lots of different perspectives there, haven't you? When you were approaching these people, dare I ask, what kind of position were you in financially? Was the film financed? Were you in a position to offer people concrete work, or was it at that stage you were trying to get the film made?
I mean, me and my co-writer Anthony were working on Censor. We made a lot of us made Nasty together, my short film, which was sort of connected to Censor in terms of its DNA. Nobody got paid for the short films. Like we were all working for nothing on those projects. And Censor was something I was always discussing with my core collaborators. So Anthony and I were developing the idea for Censor for a few years before we actually went and applied for development funding and got any money for it. So there's always a certain amount of legwork that you're doing before you're getting paid as a writer, or usually there is anyway, particularly with a debut. Annika, my DOP, I would just talk to her about the project all the time, and everybody was so excited by it that, ultimately when it comes to crew, that they're only going to actually come on board when you've got the budget to make the film. But the conversations that I was having with those people and the belief between us that we would get to make this film and the passion that we all had to make the film was there for years before making it. So, I mean, in terms of those long-term relationships, the conversations were ongoing. When it came to new collaborators, for example, my editor, Mark Towns, my production designer, Paulina Zizowska, and my composer, Emily Levianese Farouche, they were all people that I worked with for the first time on Censor. So I approached them at the point where we were crewing up those roles. I do tend to want to crew up as early as possible, because I think that, well, there's a few reasons. One is that it's an incredibly busy industry and people get booked up way in advance. So you might really want to work with a specific editor, but you get in there too late and it's just not possible. So getting in there earlier, you've got a better chance. But then on a creative level, having that thinking time, allowing that project to sort of sit in that person's head, I think is hugely beneficial. Having room for you to have conversations and introduce that team member to other HODs. For example, I, had a meeting way before we even shot the film with my sound designer and my editor. I like to bring my HODs together in order for them to get to know each other and for us all to be having a conversation about the world that we're building in terms of this story and this film, and how we're going to approach it creatively, and also how people are going to work practically as well. Because if you think, for example, about the relationship between the production designer and the cinematographer, they're collaborating. They shouldn't be separate. A production designer is putting, even on the simple level of practical lights and how you're going to build a set in order to be able to shoot it. What colors are we using and how is that going to work with the lights? All of those conversations, I think, are important for us all to be having together and feeding off each other's ideas and being inspired by other departments. So I like to have that web working as early as possible.
And what was the transition like from short films to feature film? How was your first week, for example?
Well, it's a slow ease into that first week of shooting in some ways, or, well, I don't know if slow is the right word, but you're approaching that debut or that first feature film for such a long time. We were in prep for 5 weeks and we shot for 5 weeks on Censor. And so by the time we were in the first week, we'd all been spending a lot of time together in prep. So it felt quite natural in lots of ways. I mean, essentially, you're not doing anything different on a feature to what you do on a short, except it's a longer story that you're handling. And it's a much longer shoot. So there's, it's exhausting. I think that's the main thing that's the biggest difference is, the energy that you need and the way you need to look after yourself in order to kind of maintain yourself across that longer period of time. But I think ultimately it's all about prep, and understanding that you're telling a longer story and breaking that story down and really understanding why every scene is in the film. When I was in my prep for Censor, before I got to like official prep, when you're working with the rest of the crew, I broke down the whole film in a kind of PowerPoint document, which nobody sort of said, do this. I talked to lots of different directors and tried to cherry pick the ways that they prep. But I thought, well, actually, particularly with a film like Censor, where you have so many specific references because it's set during this period and it's referencing these specific films, I felt that having one document where I could kind of almost pull in all my different ideas, whether they were for production design, sound, cinematography, that I could almost sort of just pull them all into one place and then share that with my crew. I ended up with these kind of 3 massive PowerPoints, but it was a really helpful way for me to work through the project, scene by scene, moment by moment, really, I guess, trying to articulate exactly what I was trying to achieve with each sequence or each scene. And something else that I did that I think was really beneficial, and I stole this from Francis Ford Coppola. So Francis Ford Coppola, when he was working on The Godfather, he broke down the book into what he calls the Godfather Notebook, and it's a massive book that you can buy. And he broke down every scene in the book, which ultimately became the film, by 5 points. And I can never remember every single point, but it's things like theme, images. But one of the things that he broke down was pitfalls. How could this scene not work? What are the things that could make the story go wrong if X doesn't happen in this scene? And I thought that's really helpful for me to be able to just think about the scenes like that. How could the rest of the film not work if this doesn't work in this scene? So I'd ask myself questions like that, and that helped me to identify the really most key important elements of each scene, which means when you're going in on the day and you've only got a certain amount of time, you know what your priorities are in terms of story. So an example of that could be when Enid watches Don't Go in the Church for the first time, which is a film that she watches that kind of recreates a memory that she's having difficulty accessing. I knew if that scene, if her watching that film didn't really hit her, if it didn't really affect her, then we wouldn't understand the next parts of her journey. So that was then something that I could take and talk to Niamh Alga, who played the lead character Enid. I could then construct the scene around what I needed from the performance. What did I need to tap into in Enid? And if I didn't get it, then I would be in trouble later. So it was things like that I guess were really useful kind of, techniques that I sort of started to inherit and create in order to find my way through that prep, because prepping a feature at first felt like a big hurdle for me, because you're used to doing a 10-page script, shot listing that, or a 15-page script, and suddenly it's 90 pages and it can feel a bit overwhelming. But I think it was just finding those ways in and figuring out a few techniques.
I wanted to ask about, what do you think the advantages and disadvantages are of having a genre film or a horror film as your first feature?
I think it's widely known as an advantage to make a genre film. I think in the past it's been considered a genre of film, horror being a genre of film that would, because it's got an audience, a very kind of avid fan base, that and there's this kind of myth, which I don't fully understand, that it's cheaper to make a horror. but the idea is that if you make a great horror, you've got an audience for it, so it's going to get seen by people, and if it's a good one, then there'll be kind of excitement around it. I think maybe in the past perhaps horror's been less expensive to make, but I don't really understand the myth around it being a cheaper genre to make, because you have a lot of special effects, you have a lot of added things, stunts and things that actually push the budget up higher. But I think ultimately it comes down to that idea that you can kind of get your film in front of people, and that if it's a hit, then you get known. So I think some people have kind of broken out with horror films and made horror films as their debut, and perhaps it's also because people think they're easier, that because of the audience, that they're maybe easier to finance. Whereas, if a financier is like, who's going to come and watch this coming of age drama, you might not have as many people biting. I don't really think there are necessarily any negatives to making. I think as long as you have something to say within the genre, and you're not just doing it because you want to make other kinds of films, I think that's the important thing, is don't just see it as a stepping stone to what you really want to be doing. I think people can see through that.